Incineroar is no doubt one of, if not the single greatest Pokemon ever created for VGC. Yet for some reason, despite its dominance in both Ultra Sun and Moon and Sword and Shield, it managed to receive buffs not once, but twice. The Generation 8 games gave it moves like Parting Shot, which has allowed it a far more potent switching option than the U-turn ever had, and it gives it variants outside of just needing an Assault Vest. And Generation 9 added moves like Helping Hand, which while it isn't the most used on Incineroar, is still one of the best support moves ever created. Today, I want to evaluate how Incineroar could logically be buffed going into Generation 10, and to do this, we're going to take a look at a few different types of angles. These will be first, of course, going over how Incineroar has been buffed, and the second will be, will these buffs even matter, and what moves could actually make an impact at this point? Because Incineroar basically has the perfect toolkit already, and it would be very hard to improve this Pokemon. If you enjoy videos like this, of course, and you want to see me talk about other Pokemon that could maybe get buffed and how the best way to do that would be, make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe for more content just like this, as I talk about a lot of laughably weak Pokemon such as the regional bugs recently and many other Pokemon like that. While you're at it, let me know what buffs you guys would give Incineroar down below, as I'd love to see what types of buffs you guys can come up with. Finally, if you want videos like this a couple days sooner on Thursdays, as well as the potential to vote on topics like this, make sure to become a member, which for just a couple dollars a month, you get to have your say be heard in terms of what we upload on the channel for different content such as this, or the upcoming video where we'll be buffing a class of Pokemon that my members are going to be voting on. There should be a couple more days to vote on that, and if you're watching this video on Sunday, I will probably be closing the polling for that on Tuesday, so get your votes in soon. With that said though, let's try and break down how we could even buff Incineroar in the first place. One of the hardest things about buffing a Pokemon that's as perfect as Incineroar is finding out how to actually make its buffs have meaningful usage. We can get a pretty good idea of what this would mean in a good and bad sense by just looking at how Incineroar has been buffed over the years. Generation 8 gave it a lot of different moves, for example, and in total, we received 9 moves. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. We first need to start off with what Generation 8 changed from Generation 7. And there were a few different things that actually hurt Incineroar pretty greatly, which is probably why Game Freak decided that it needed buffs in the first place. The first, of course, was Dynamax, which actually fundamentally hurt Incineroar pretty badly, considering it guaranteed every team that used a Dynamax Pokemon had one Pokemon for 3 turns that was completely immune to options like Fake Out. And not only this, but we now had 4 abilities that got the added effect of blocking the effects of Intimidate entirely. These were abilities that typically had no use in competitive, or at the very least never really saw play, being Own Tempo, Inner Focus, Scrappy, and Oblivious. These nerfs were honestly pretty heavy for Incineroar, so I can kind of get why it got some buffs, but I think one of these in particular was pretty detrimental to the future of competitive. In total, Incineroar, as I mentioned, got 9 different moves in VGC, with 5 of these never actually seeing high usage. Now this is a little bit surprising because there were definitely moves like Close Combat and Scorching Sands on this list that could have been pretty useful to Incineroar, since they give it meaningful coverage into a lot of different top tiers, like Scorching Sands being a 4 times effective move against Gigantamax Colossal, for example. Meanwhile, Stakataka is 4 times weak to both Close Combat and Scorching Sands, and there were plenty of other Pokemon such as Opposing Incineroar that still got harmed by these moves, or most other Pokemon at least could get neutrally hit by these. However, there were 4 different moves that saw play on occasion, 3 of which were different offensive moves, being Burning Jealousy, Assurance, and Lash Out. Now these 3 different moves all saw around 10 to 20% usage, and they were typically 4th move options on Assault Vest Incineroar. Now I won't act like these were the greatest moves, but they did have their own place, such as Burning Jealousy being a good option into opposing Zacian teams, with Lash Out being a good option into any team that was just really powerful at pivoting. And Assurance was pretty good, at least in Series 12, because of the fact that Incineroar was hitting slower than a lot of Pokemon, and it was a good way to keep up the damage output into threats like Calyrex and Lunala. However, there was one buff that Incineroar got, which was strictly just a better version of a move it was already using, being U-turn. And that buff came in the form of Parting Shot. Now this move is so good because Incineroar now has a lot less reliance on the Assault Vest item, since I could just use Parting Shot to still weaken special opponents. Not only this, but it allows another physical attack drop on the user as well, meaning that you don't just have to use this on special threats, and it allows Incineroar to get out of the game to then bring it back in for not only another Intimidate, but another chance at using the move Fake Out. Now there was one more item in Scarlet and Violet that was added as a means of handling the Fake Out aspect of Incineroar, and this was the Covert Cloak. And it has a lot of other effects, such as blocking stat drop effects from moves like Snarl and Breaking Swipe, but typically you're using this as a way to get an immunity to Fake Out. And it's a pretty useful nerf against Incineroar. However, even if your opponent is running both Covert Cloak and Clear Amulet, there are still 2 different Pokemon, at least in any given match, that will be very threatened by the entirety of Incineroar's toolkit. So it still has seen a lot of play in Scarlet and Violet, however, it's no longer a metagame staple. Though this is more so to do with the introduction of a lot of higher power threats, such as the Paradox Pokemon and the Ruin Pokemon. So I think it's less on Incineroar getting nerfed, it's more that there are a lot better Pokemon in the field now. Despite this, Incineroar still manages to be one of the best Pokemon of all time in VGC, and it still did get some pretty big buffs this gen. The first is a little bit less meaningful, being Helping Hand, which, while it's a really broken support move, it doesn't really see much play on Incineroar. And it's a little bit weird to say that because it's still a great move in Generation 9, and it sees a lot of play on Pokemon like Clefairy, Indeedee, Pelipper, and Farigiraf, to name a very small few. Despite this though, Incineroar just can't really justify running this, because it already has Fake Out, Flare Blitz, and Parting Shot that are all so hard ingrained to its moveset that typically you're really only going to maybe find Helping Hand on rain teams where it's still competing with moves like Taunt. The one move that did get added to Incineroar that's pretty detrimental to a lot of opponents though is Knockoff. Now technically Incineroar could use Knockoff in Ultra Sun and Moon, and if you transferred it up to Sword and Shield, you could at least use it in non-VGC matches. However, in Generation 9, this is now an actual move that you could use in VGC again. This is a pretty big deal, and this has essentially made Incineroar a pretty standardized Pokemon using Knockoff, Fake Out, and Parting Shot on every team that you run it on. I'd be very hard pressed to find a player not running these moves unless it's an Assault Vest Incineroar, where you would then see Parting Shot swapped out for U-Turn, or if you're running it on Rain, where you'll typically see Taunt over Flare Blitz. Otherwise though, Incineroar's moveset has typically been standardized to Flare Blitz, Knockoff, Fake Out, and Parting Shot. And it's a really good moveset. Incineroar has a lot of other strong moves in its toolkit though, such as Snarl, and Helping Hand that I've already mentioned that it got this generation, and even moves like Close Combat, which is still kept from Sword and Shield, but ultimately, you just really can't justify any other fourth move unless you have a very good reason. And these are typically still suboptimal moves for Incineroar, they just happen to fit a team archetype slightly better. So now that we know the moves that Incineroar typically does use in any given match, there are a lot of broken support moves that really just don't work on Incineroar. Now considering Incineroar is best utilized to allow other Pokemon to gain an advantage turn, this means that we're going to have to roll out moves like Tailwind, Trick Room, Reflect, and Light Screen. Now all these moves would typically be okay on Incineroar due to the fact that it's just still a really good Pokemon overall, and it would be very hard to find these moves being bad in any situation. You would typically want to use Incineroar next to a Pokemon setting up these moves, such as Whimsicott, Tornadus, Farigiraf, and Grimmsnarl, to name a very small few set of partners that all really benefit from being put next to an Incineroar. Now you might be thinking that maybe Incineroar could have a niche as a bulky Tailwind option, and I would honestly say I don't even think it would be the best bulky Tailwind Pokemon, since Corviknight typically has some pretty good success as a good mirror armor candidate, and its typing is still really hard to kill in certain formats. I don't think Incineroar would really be outclassing Corviknight, and honestly Corviknight would still probably benefit from a non-Tailwind Incineroar next to it anyway. Meanwhile, for Trick Room setters, it would be pretty impossible to not just say that Farigiraf and Incineroar would be the best way to utilize this duo, which means you just don't need to run Trick Room on Incineroar since you would always just click it on Farigiraf anyway. Screens are already kind of niche regardless in VGC, and really if you're not using a prankster Pokemon like Grimmsnarl, you have no business setting them, so I'm not even going to entertain this being an actual option, but I did want to include it since these are other types of field conditions to a degree, and I just don't see Incineroar actually running them. Even if it managed to get Aurora Veil for some reason, we're not running Incineroar on a snow team to set Veil. That's a lowly Ninetales job. Now there are a bunch of other miscellaneous status moves that could technically be ran, but they're not going to be the most optimal. These are mostly going to be ran on rain teams where you're ditching Flare Blitz, and I could see them at least being as notable as Helping Hand. The big ones would be Encore, Disable, Follow Me, Decorate, and Ally Switch. For starters, Encore and Disable typically are better suited for faster threats, as we've seen a lot of success on Pokemon like Screamtail and Whimsicott with these, so I really doubt that Incineroar would be fast enough to actually make them work without getting a very serious heavy prediction on an opponent. Now Follow Me and Decorate are two very interesting options, and I could see some teams legitimately running these. However, while Follow Me is typically really good on bulkier Pokemon, you often are trying to keep Incineroar alive as long as possible due to the fact that it's still very useful at stat dropping most teams, and while you could make a case that maybe in matchups with Heavy Clear Amulet and Intimidate immune Pokemon, that it might not be the most useful at this role, you would probably still benefit more from a move like Will-O-Wisp in this case anyway. Meanwhile, while Decorate could be really good at setting up an offensive threat next to Incineroar, which typically that would fall in line with Incineroar's job of setting up offensive threats to win the game anyway. At the same time though, I just can't really find a move that you would actually justify dropping for outside of maybe Flare Blitz, which at that point you would probably still benefit more from a move like Taunt, which could give Rain and Out to Trick Room teams, which it typically would struggle against. Now Ally Switch I think is the closest to a noteworthy move that Incineroar could have ran. However, with the nerf that it got in Scarlet and Violet, making it so it runs on the same counter that Protect does, I really can't can't see Incineroar just really spamming this move, causing serious mind games to opponents. Since Incineroar doesn't even like running Protect on its own set to keep itself alive, I highly doubt it's going to be then throwing itself in front of opponents to just sack itself. And similar to Follow Me, I just don't see this being a really useful move on Incineroar. Now, there are some other cool moves in the literal status department, though I think only two even kind of stand out, being Dire Claw and Spore. A Dire Claw I think really would only see play on Assault Vest Incineroar, as it at least still gives you a way to harm grass type Pokemon, but the inconsistency of status here I really don't think makes it worth. Meanwhile, while Spore is a really broken sleep move, I think Incineroar would typically be better either partnering with an Amoonguss to use Spore, or just going for Will-O-Wisp, as it's typically the status move of choice on Incineroar against opponents that can't be intimidated. Now, if I haven't already mentioned your favorite Incineroar support move option to get in Generation 10, don't worry, as there's going to be a huge list on screen of other moves that I think are just outright not even worth mentioning. Now, these aren't entirely support moves, but majority of them are. I did want to include some really broken moves in general though, like Salt Cure and Last Respects, just to show the bar that we need to meet to actually get a move that would truly be meaningful on Incineroar. That's not to say that I don't think players would try and run moves like these, but ultimately I don't see them having a place. And with the one exception of Sketch being on Incineroar, just because of the fact that it would be funny, I kept Sketch off specifically from this list because Sketch would just give you any move anyway, and at that point, why bother talking about the video? Because frankly, there are 4 moves that you would actually be using on Incineroar that we haven't discussed yet that all have a really respectable purpose on a moveset. Now, there are 2 in particular I want to start off with, as both these moves would find a place on strictly either Assault Vest or Rain, but they would be strictly better options than existing moves. The first one, of course, is Ruination, which I think would actually be a very good move on Incineroar for Rain and Assault Vest builds. Now, while I did include Super Fang on the long list of moves that weren't worth acknowledging, Ruination at least has no immunity, such as a ghost typing that Super Fang would have to worry about. And unless you're a Wonder Guard Pokemon that isn't Shedinja, due to the fact that Shedinja can still take damage from Ruination due to it being a ghost type, you're gonna be taking at least a substantial amount of damage from this, as Ruination does half of your existing HP in damage. Now, this means if your Pokemon is at 80% and you take Ruination, you're now brought down to 40%. And it's a great way to just have a heavy hit get off on an opponent that doesn't really have to take your defensive stats into account. This means that Incineroar could get a seriously damaging move into Pokemon like Dondozo, for example, where otherwise would have no real matchup into, and I think it could at least give Assault Vest sets a lot more of a potent way to deal damage, and it could be great next to offensive partners that would otherwise really struggle to maybe 2-KO these types of threats. Meanwhile, Pollen Puff could be a very interesting move on Incineroar, especially on Rain teams, as while you could definitely utilize this move as another form of grass coverage that wouldn't have to get weakened by the rain, you would still have to use Incineroar's weaker offensive stat. However, the big reason to use Pollen Puff would instead be to heal allies on Assault Vest builds, because you could still deal damage with this move if you wanted to, but if you target a partner slot instead, you now give them back 50% of their HP. Now, this is a pretty big deal considering the fact that Incineroar would have a way to strictly heal an opponent better than a move like Heal Pulse, and it would give a really strong 4th move to Assault Vest sets that are typically going to be running moves like Snarl instead. Now, I think that Pollen Puff would still be a lackluster option to say the least compared to our last 2 moves, but it's noteworthy enough because it's essentially just a better version of Heal Pulse, and it gets around options like Taunt, it can be used on Assault Vest sets, and it has many other things that just make it strictly better than moves like Heal Pulse or even Life Dew. So I did want to include it at least as one of these 4 noteworthy moves. Now, we do have 2 options that I think could actually see some genuine play on Incineroar due to the fact that these would be physical Fire Stab options. Now, while we could totally give Incineroar a move like Raging Fury or V-Create just to do some higher damage, I don't really think Incineroar benefits from either a move that locks it in itself for 2 to 3 turns despite taking no recoil, or a move that, while it does a lot more damage than Flare Blitz, would weaken Incineroar defensively. I think we're looking at a Fire Stab replacement. We only have 2 moves that fit the bill, and while they give up a little bit of offensive power from Flare Blitz, they don't have any serious drawbacks. The first of these, of course, is Bitter Blade, which actually has 0 downside to it, and instead just gives Incineroar a 90 base power physical fire move that gives you back 50% of the health and damage you dealt. This means if I deal 100 damage to an opponent, I get 50% of my health back on Incineroar, and that's a pretty meaningful recovery, especially because Incineroar had no way to heal itself in the first place outside of using Rest. This means that you could partner this with options like Citrus Berry or Grassy Terrain, and get some serious longevity on a Pokemon that can pivot like this, and with the moveset of Bitter Blade, Knockoff, Parting Shot, and Fake Out, Incineroar become very difficult to kill. Now, this is very unlikely on Incineroar due to the lack of a blade on this Pokemon, but the other fire type signature move we'd be looking at here, which is Sacred Fire, actually has some serious merit on Incineroar, and I could see this being a legitimately given option if we were to ever get an Incineroar event again. Now, Sacred Fire is pretty interesting, because while this technically does have a drawback in its 95% accuracy, it is a strict upgrade on the move Will-O-Wisp for Incineroar. While Will-O-Wisp does have an 85% accuracy and a 100% 50% chance to burn when it lands. Sacred Fire is a 95% accurate move that deals 100 base power damage on the physical fire side, but it also has a 50% chance to burn the target if it hits. This means that anytime you click Sacred Fire, you essentially have a 47.5% chance to burn the target if you include the accuracy in the move. And honestly, it's a pretty big deal because unlike a move like Will-O-Wisp, you can still use this to burn targets when you have an Assault Vest, and you're not going to be affected by Taunt, while you also don't give up the fact that Incineroar will be dealing high base power damage. This move also hits 10 base power harder than Bitter Blade, and I think it makes it at least pretty worth it considering your accuracy is slightly worse. So I think really both moves could see genuine place on Incineroar, and these would be strict upgrades on Flare Blitz at least. If we're trying to find a move that is a guarantee use on Incineroar, these are two of the clearest cut options, though I could still see a lot of other moves that we've went over today, even the ones that I've went over serious drawbacks for, still getting some actual play on Incineroar. As the Pokemon that is so versatile in what it can run, that it's pretty hard to make a bad Incineroar moveset. If I didn't cover your favorite move today though, make sure to let me know down below, as I'd love to hear what you guys think would be the best develops for Incineroar. While you're on the way down there, of course, make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe for more. We're on the way to 5K, and I'd love to hit it by the end of the year. With your guys' support, I seriously think we could do that. If you want to get some input on videos we do on the channel though, make sure to hit the join button, as for just a couple dollars a month, you get to vote on topics like this for videos where I'm picking out a certain Pokemon to improve. And on top of it as well, you get your name at the end of the video shouted out, and you get some early access to these videos every Thursday. I feel like for just $5 a month, these are some pretty cool perks, and if you are interested in that, of course, the join button is down below. Current members are Josh K Ultra Player and Zeke0. Thank you guys very much for your guys' support in the channel. It means the world. This money also, of course, helps to pay our editors, Dose and Becca, both of which do an incredible job in the channel. They both edit all the long form content you guys see on the channel, and we even have some short form content that goes up thanks to Becca. And if you want to check out either person, both of their links are going to be down below, as they both do an incredible job. Especially if you like today's video, this was edited by Dose, of course, and again, both their links are going to be down below. They both do an incredible job on everything you see on this channel, and I really couldn't do it without them. With that said though, I'll see you guys in next week's video. Until then, peace out guys.